I will be talking today about designing school choice for diversity in the San Francisco Unified School District. And this is joint work with Itai Ashlagi, with students Kaylee Mentzer and Max Allman, who are sitting right here in our room, and also Juliette, Lulabel, and Henry, who was working at the district at the time. Okay, so the main problem that I want you to have in the back of your minds for today's talk is that schools across the US are segregating. What I'm showing you here is a plot of the percentage of Black students in minority schools. These are schools with 90% or more underrepresented racial minorities. And you can see that this percentage has been decreasing since it was ruled unconstitutional in the 50s to have segregated schools, but then increasing again since the 80s. And this is problematic because for many reasons, but one reason is that recent research from the Stanford Educational Opportunity Project shows that the confluence of segregation of racial minorities in high poverty schools is particularly correlated with large racial achievement gaps. So the lens we're going to take today to try to start to address this issue is by looking at student assignment policies. These are the policies that govern the processes by which students are assigned to public schools. By and large, in the policy discourse, there are two kinds of policies that are discussed. The first is neighborhood assignment, where students just go to their neighborhood school. And the second is the one which I'll be focusing on today, which is called school choice. In school choice, we let students express preferences over usually all of the schools in the district, and then an algorithm will decide where they get to go. And the goal here is to let students tell the district or choose where they want to go to school. And so what I'm going to do today is start with this case study in the San Francisco Unified School District. Using this case study, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we used school choice theory to suggest and then also evaluate potential policies for use in SFUSD. And then I'll tell you about some of the results of our work and how they informed the decision of a new policy that was approved in 2020 for use starting in 2025. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into the San Francisco context. In San Francisco, I'm going to be calling the district SFUSD for short, we're trying to assign about 5,000 incoming students, think kindergartners, to about 70 different programs at 50 different schools. And I have here for you a map of the school district. Now, in San Francisco, like many districts across the US, choice has been used to try to give students a chance to go to schools across the whole district. And so in San Francisco, choice has been used since 2011. One of the goals of choice has been to disentangle neighborhood and school segregation. So what I'm showing you here is a map from 2010 census data where each of these colored dots represents a household and the color represents the race of that household. And you can see there are clear patterns of segregation. Just to point one of those out, our Black students, who comprise just 5% of the school-going population, are the bright green dots in this map, and you can see really clear clusters. One particularly noticeable one is down here in the southeast of the district. And so the question is, has allowing school choice helped disentangle school segregation from neighborhood segregation? Unfortunately, the answer is not really. What I'm showing you here is based on data from 2018, so this is 7 years after choice has been implemented in San Francisco, and I want you to look at this left map here. I have in the background a heat map of the percentage of students living in the area who are racial minorities. So this is African American, Latinx, or Pacific Islander. And then superimposed on top of that, I have dots. You can see the blue dots the most clearly. Those blue dots are the 50% of schools which have the highest percentage of such students enrolled in the school. Okay, you can see that the blue dots basically map on top of the darkest areas of the heat map. And we see similar patterns on the right if we look at socioeconomic status as measured by eligibility for free or reduced price lunch. So motivated by this and other challenges, in 2018, the San Francisco Board of Education resolved to redesign student assignment toward the goals of diversity, predictability, and proximity. The problem that they faced was the existing school choice policies or student assignment policies had limitations in being able to address all of these goals. Okay, so if we think about neighborhood assignment, this faces the challenge that the neighborhoods themselves are segregated. And if we look at district-wide choice, which was being used in San Francisco, we actually see that there's choice-driven segregation and that none of the district's goals are being met. And so to address this, they introduced several policy concepts which aimed at basically giving enough choice to combat residential segregation while controlling choice enough so that we don't get choice-driven resegregation or students assigned to schools that are really, really far away. And here are their policy concepts. The first was to initially assign students to a neighborhood school and let them opt in to choice. And then the second and third concepts were basically to restrict students to choose from either small or medium-sized geographic zones, respectively. And so this was the context that we entered into when we started working with the district in 2019 to redesign their student assignment policy. Now I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about how we drew on existing school choice theory and also used some optimization to augment the set of policies that they were considering and also to evaluate them. A quick slide on related literature. I'm not going to have time today to do justice to a very, very huge literature on school choice, and so what I want you to focus on is just these little colored bubbles that I've put here for you. So by and large, the school choice literature defines mechanisms such as deferred acceptance and top trading cycles with desirable economic properties like strategy proofness or stability. And then it uses inputs to these mechanisms in order to guide the allocation. Okay, so as inputs, you should have in mind things like priorities for example, students who have siblings at the school or students who live in the neighborhood of the school, or menus that restrict the set of schools that a student is eligible or can choose from, or reserves that set aside seats at schools for certain types of students. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this theory about mechanisms and their inputs and think about what that means for policy in San Francisco. There are a lot of decisions that we had to make, which I'm happy to talk about offline. I'm just going to highlight a few of them for you here. Some things include, well, which mechanism should we use? Should we use deferred acceptance or top trading cycles? From 2011 through to 2018, San Francisco actually used some form of hybrid where they used deferred acceptance and they did some kind of trading cycle, but it wasn't really top trading cycles. The mechanism ended up being neither strategy proof nor efficient, and so it caused a lot of confusion. I'm happy to talk more about that offline, but the short of it is that we presented the trade-offs between deferred acceptance and top trading cycles to the district, and they decided they like deferred acceptance more. We also did some initial simulations on concept 1, and we showed that in giving this optional choice after being initially assigned to your neighborhood school didn't really improve diversity. In addition, also drawing from the literature, in Boston there's this idea of the home-based plan, which I referred to before as menus. The idea is that each family gets a personalized menu of choices, and by appropriately designing menus, you can kind of recover what you would be trying to do by appropriately designing priorities. And so we proposed this also as a policy concept to the district. And so based on these initial conversations, we evaluated a couple of different policies. The first was this vanilla zones policy. This was concepts 2 and 3 that was proposed by the district. On top of that, drawing from all of the literature, we considered adding reserves to the zones policy. We also considered a home-based policy like the one in Boston with or without reserves. And in this particular home-based policy I'm showing you today, we're restricting students to choose from menus of the four closest schools from each SES tercile. And then finally, we also used just priorities to achieve distributional goals. This was probably the typical way that school choice thinks about trying to achieve some social objective outside of efficiency or strategy proofness, or stability, rather. Okay, so these are the 5 policies that we analyzed. And how did we instantiate these policies? We had to decide in particular on which zones to use. And so we took an optimization-based approach where we generated feasible zones from building blocks using an integer program. And I'll show you some of the constraints in that program in just a moment. That was kind of step 1. And then in step 2, we took some of these generated zone maps that the district liked, and then we ran counterfactual choice on these zone maps to be able to evaluate how they perform after choice. Now, it is possible to combine these 2 stages into one really, really huge math program, but now this math program is even harder to, computationally more difficult than the one that I'm going to show you now. And so what was the math program? I'm going to show you using pictures. We had constraints capturing the size of the program. So how many schools are we going to have in each zone? How many zones do we want to have? We had constraints capturing the shape of the zones. So are the zones contiguous? Can you get from one piece of zone to every other piece by walking, or are they kind of islands? In fact, these contiguity and also compactness, like how circular and non-snaky is your zone, these kinds of constraints are the ones that you, for example, typically see in gerrymandering and make the optimization problem hard. On top of that, we also had balance constraints, for example, students across zones, students in seats, demographics, as well as school performance and popularity. Next, what we did was we took these initial decisions, which are just kind of the mechanism design part. What are the policies we're considering? What are the mechanisms? What are the zones? And we built an end-to-end simulation tool that allowed us to test and evaluate these policies. So as I mentioned before, we had to simulate counterfactual choice. And so how we did that was we have 3 components. The first is just a very standard approach of building a multinomial logit choice model to predict students' utilities at all the schools. On top of that, because we want to see what the resulting assignment looks like and properties of the assignment, we did a couple of things that are not really been explored in the literature so far. One thing we observed is that students from different groups list different number of schools. So black families listing on average 3 programs versus white families listing on average 15 programs. And so we needed to capture that, because if you list fewer programs, then you're going to be assigned to different places. And we also saw that in San Francisco, between 15 to 20% of students actually opt out of their assignment, potentially for private or charter school options. And so that's also something we need to capture when looking at the overall outcomes. And finally, we also spent quite a bit of time working with education school colleagues to define metrics, teams of students building all kinds of visualization tools. I won't really have time to go into those today. Okay, so in my remaining 4 minutes, let me show you some of our results. The results I'm showing you today are based on historical admissions data to kindergarten from 2013 through 2020, and we also have corresponding enrollment the following year. And the student population I'm going to use is incoming kindergartners for the 2018-19 academic year. We're going to simulate their preferences using a choice model and this opting out, which are estimated using 5 years worth of preferences. And all the results I'm showing you are averaged to over 100 realizations of the lottery that is used in deferred acceptance, as well as there's inherent randomness when we sample the preferences from the choice model. Okay. So here are the policies. I have my home-based policies. I have my zone policies, both of these with and without reserves. I have the priorities policy. And as a benchmark, we have the actual assignment in 2018-19. And I have here just one representative metric for each of the district goals, as well as for choice, because this is school choice and we care about choice. And this is a lot of numbers, so let me walk you slowly through just a few of them. First, let's look at diversity. Here I'm measuring diversity using the percentage of underrepresented racial minorities, that's African American, Latinx, and Pacific Islanders, in schools with over 67% for reduced price lunch eligibility. So this number is chosen to be 15% more than the district average. And you can see that this percent decreased compared to the actual assignment from 29% to 11% and 13% respectively, using zones and reserves and priorities, but that the other policies are not doing such a good job at achieving the diversity goal. Next, let's look at proximity. Here, this is measured by the average distance in miles for the student from their home to the assigned school. And here you can see that all of the policies which restrict choice to a closer by menu improve on distance by a little bit compared to the status quo, but using priorities significantly increases distance. And finally, let's look at choice. Not surprisingly, policies that restrict choice significantly reduce choice, here measured by the percentage of students who are assigned to one of their top 3 choices. And this is a problem, because what we did in our initial conversations with the district is we said, let's say all students who are not assigned to any of their choices, so nothing on their list, all these students, we do actually assign them somewhere, but they're all going to drop out. Okay? So if all of these students opt out, this wonderful number of 11% underrepresented minority at high poverty schools now goes all the way up to 40%. And so this is potentially a big issue. Okay, nonetheless, at the time of this conversation, this was the kind of data we were showing the district, and they said, choice is not a policy goal. This wonderful zones and reserves policy achieves all of the district goals. This one looks great to us. Okay, so we were a little bit worried about this, and so we have been doing some post hoc work after the policy decision to look at, well, what do we really expect the effect of opt-out to be? Now, the caveat that we don't really have the data to be able to predict very well how students will opt out, and also based on what we presented before, the district is really trying to invest in sort of community confidence in schools that they have all these examples of schools that they were able to, within the space of 1 or 2 years, transform from really unpopular schools to the most highly requested schools. And so with all of that in mind, here's what happens using a regression model, a regression tree model for who's going to drop out after they've been assigned. What we find is, let me toggle between these two for you. I've just adjusted the underlying heat map to represent the numbers in parentheses, which are the numbers after the dropout. And you see, by and large, that the pattern, this diagonal green line, stays the same. That this trade-off between choice, diversity, and distance is just inherently there in the problem, and these types of policies kind of trade off the same way before and after opt-out. Okay, so based on this, in 2020, the following policy was approved for use starting 2025. We're going to restrict choice using geographic zones and control it using reserves. And we're going to improve outcomes for particular target students using something called an equity priority. Now, there's a lot of additional challenges and considerations here, which I'll just highlight 2 in the interest of time. First, just naming some of the shortcomings of our own approach. We really focused on optimizing zone-based policies due to what the district was looking for. But really, there's a lot more that we left unexplored. There could be other simple home-based policies, other simple policies that perform better. And we're still in the process of deciding, well, what are the specific reserves that we should be using? What are the specific equity priorities we should be using? And how much does this also affect the assignment? There's also all kinds of unintended consequences of using a zone-based policy. This thing I named before, this problem that we're really reducing choice, right? From 80-something% of students to 60-something% getting one of their top 3 choices. In addition, in discussion, there's also been some interesting benefits of a zone-based policy where it's allowed for what the district calls a paradigm shift, for people to completely change how they think about student assignment, and in particular, supporting things like better transportation and moving programs around to be more equitable. So lots of next steps. I don't have time to go through those. I'm really excited in particular about the last one, looking at the effects of residential patterns. Happy to talk about all of these offline. And that concludes my talk. Thank you for coming. Okay. In the interest of time, we can take one question while we switch to the virtual setup.
So I thought it was really interesting, and I liked, of course, the picture. So I have a kind of like high-level question, which is, and I think you mentioned this, which is something like, look, suppose we fixed the mechanism deferred acceptance, and then all we did was we just picked the priorities at each school. I mean, presumably you could get something similar by picking the priorities in some way. So your preferred solution, or the one that was adopted, do you have a sense of, like, roughly speaking, like what the effect is in terms of priorities compared to what there was before? Like, does it take regions that are segregated and give those students like basically higher priority elsewhere, or what's the?
So I'll repeat the question for those on Gather. The question was, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, that essentially if we appropriately design priorities at each school, we could achieve something that looks more like what I'm calling the zone and reserves outcome. And so the question was, could I talk a little bit about the priorities? What would the priorities look like? in order to achieve those kinds of outcomes. So essentially, what the zones and reserves policy does is it restricts people from choosing schools that are potentially just outside their zone, what they want to go to, or very far outside their zone, but are very, very popular. Okay? And so one way you could achieve that choosing priorities is giving some kind of combination of distance-based priorities and also priorities that resemble these reserves that we're using. And functionally, our reserves are quite similar to a priority that gives priority first to the least, or the historically most disadvantaged group, lets them choose first. They actually tend to choose in a way that's quite equal across the district. But on top of that, we would have to take away priority from some of them who want to go really far across the district. So essentially what we're doing is we're restricting people to go to a school close by home, and usually they have at least something nearby where they add diversity, where they are interested in going to, but it's maybe not their top choice or even one of their top 2 choices. Okay, so with that, let me move to the next speaker, and I'll let our virtual session chair introduce him.